during our worship earlier today. Our hope is to have a few different educational events throughout the year as we move towards our real celebratory blowout weekend, which is the weekend of it's September the 30th. Friday, September the 30th will be our big celebration. But we begin with an educational offering, working chronologically, on the three women that we have always recognized as our founders here at St. Stephen's, who are memorialized on the wall to my left: Sarah Russell, Sarah Rutledge, and Sarah Haan. And I hope you've had opportunities to walk over and read the inscriptions. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to do so after our time is done this evening. And we're so very happy to have Miss Karen Bloom with us from the Historic Charleston Foundation, who will be talking to us about these women and about their context at the time of our founding. And I just want to begin by reading a little bit of what we have on our website. So on our website, we do have a historical section, and under 1822, our website reads, "St. Stephen's holds a unique place among the American Episcopal Church. Our church was the first place of worship in Charleston, and in all the churches in which pews were not rented or sold, but free to all worshipers." That is something that is our understanding, Karen, up to this point. Beginning in 1822, the congregation met in a rented room, and then in 1824, a small church, then called St. Stephen's Chapel, was erected on Ginyard Street, close to the market. However, that building burned in a great fire in 1835, and a year later, the present structure, the structure that we are all sitting in at 67 Anson Street, was erected and consecrated on November 24th, 1836. Sarah Hopton Russell, Sarah Haan, and Sarah Rutledge, collectively known to us as the three Sarahs, were instrumental in establishing St. Stephen's as women dedicated to philanthropy and religious education for all. And my understanding is that these three women were part of an Episcopal female benevolence organization that gave the funds for the building of this mission as a mission to the poor of Charleston. And I have wondered, as I've walked around where Ginyard Street is, exactly where the original St. Stephen's was. My understanding from somebody who spoke to me about this, who's a native of the city, is that if you go over to the market today, there's a big parking lot now, and that parking lot did not exist back in 1822. And so Ginyard Street stretched across where that parking lot is, and there is a restaurant now called Hank's Seafood, I believe, and my understanding is that is approximately the location that the original St. Stephen's was erected. The other little tidbit that I'm aware of when our church was founded, that again I've just sort of heard about as I've talked to people in the city, is that when St. Stephen's was founded, the three Sarahs had put into the bylaws that we would be a church where single pregnant women would be welcome to worship, which in 1822 I think was a pretty forward-thinking thing to do. So there definitely was some forward thinking there for 1822 when we were founded, although I think Karen will be talking to us a little bit about the history as she knows it, and I think helping us to try to look back at this year, which was a consequential year in Charleston, because 1822, as I understand it, was also the year of the Denmark VC uprising here. So I would imagine as our mission was founded, that must have been very much on the minds and in the conversations of people around Charleston at the time. So welcome to those listening in on our live stream. Ms. Bloom will be speaking from here in the lectern, and when we have our Q&A, I've asked her to repeat any questions that are given so that folks listening in can follow along. But without further ado, Karen, welcome. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thanks. Hello, everybody. My name is Karen Bloom, and I am thrilled to be here. It was delightful to receive this question about the three Sarahs, and frankly, there's not a whole lot in the historical record about the church that isn't in your bylaws. So if you have access to that document, I recommend that you read it. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Karen Bloom. I am part of the Historic Charleston Foundation as of September last year. Before that, I had the great privilege to work at Middleton Place Foundation, founded by your own Charles Dole. So I am really grateful for my time here in Charleston. Before that, I worked for Drayton Hall. I have had the great good fortune to work for some of the finest historical institutions in Charleston. And it's my pleasure to be here and to do a little research on your behalf. I learned a lot as well. And today I really wanted to talk about the world that Sarah Hopton Russell, Sarah Russell Haan, and Sarah Rutledge lived in. I gather that you all probably know a little bit about the origins of your own space here, but I wanted to give you a broader context of the world that they were moving in the early 19th century. Not even really up until the Civil War. Each of these women, the last one passes away in 1857. So Civil War wasn't even in the picture really yet. So with that in mind, I wanted to give a little bit of information about time and place, what Charleston may have looked and sounded and felt like, and how women moved in that space. Particularly women who were wealthy and able to give charity. The world of the Sarahs, both internal and external, was really complex. So there are definitely some hard truths that we have to talk about today, but it's important that you understand that the mission that the women founded here and the work that they did, the charitable works that they did, are so important and absolutely stand as a testament to the work that they did in the whole city of Charleston. Really important to remember that. Okay, so let's go with the next slide. Thank you. Oh, and hi to everybody at home. I don't know where the camera is. Is that it over there? Hi. Thanks for being here on the live stream. This millennial loves it. Okay. I'm so excited about that. That's lovely. And hello to later YouTube watchers. Okay. So starting with Sarah, I had a great time looking into Sarah's history a little bit. Sarah Hopton Russell, and I will preface this by saying that most of this presentation is actually going to focus on Sarah Russell, Sarah Hopton Russell, and Sarah Russell Haan. These are the records that I have extensive access to in the Historic Charleston Foundation archives. Sarah Rutledge is a little harder to pin down. For being a name that is quite well known, she is difficult to find in the historic record, and that's true of a lot of women. So we're gonna, right, everybody's yes, I know. So we're gonna start with Sarah Hopton Russell. She was born here locally in South Carolina in 1752. She was born on Hopton Plantation, that's what it was called in the 19th century. Her father, William Hopton, called it Starvegut Plantation. And this is a really old map that you can access from, it's not an old map, it's a map of older properties that you can get from Dunes West. So she lived over in Mount Pleasant in the brick-making district. So she did grow up on a plantation. William Hopton's plantation was a brick-making plantation, and probably very much on the order of Boone Hall today. So think about that the tasking out at the Hopton plantation is probably mostly in brick making for the enslaved community there. historical accounts say that Starvgut Hall was not great in terms of cultivatable land. It didn't work well for rice, it didn't work well for cotton, but what it had was a lot of fine clay. So that was a brick-making operation. It's located in Christchurch Parish, and I did do that little zoom in there so that you can see that Hopton is indeed named on this older map, and I don't know if that little arrow shows up on the screen. That one over there? Okay, great. Never sure when I'm making them on the screen this big how they're gonna look on the screen that big. So she was a member of the elite planter class, and because of that, certain things are expected of Sarah Hopton as a young woman in Charleston and its surrounds. As part of the planter class, of course, she's part of the wealthy elite, so marriage is top of the list, preferably to somebody of her same station. And she would have learned the duties of a head of a household staff of enslaved people very early on, probably from her own mother. And even so, even though we're looking at these traditional gender roles that Sarah most likely occupied and was encouraged to occupy, we have glimpses in the historical record of where she actually had some differing ideas. She ended up marrying a man who had some differing ideas, and it ended in a really interesting mix of progressive and traditional lifestyle. As she got older, she became very close with her pastor at St. Michael's Church, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but it seems that as she grew into adulthood and then into her elder sort of matriarch role, she became more devout and more interested in the works of the church, and that's how we find her spearheading the missions that she did. Let's move on to the next one. So I didn't know this, I found this out. There's a historical marker for Starvgut Hall. You can go and see it. I'm not gonna read this whole thing. If you're interested in this slide deck, I can certainly give you a copy of the slide deck at a later date if people are interested. Or you can go over to Mount Pleasant and read the historical marker, but it talks about the very, very early days of the property from 1699. It goes through a series of owners and land grants. It talks about how William Hopton's wife, Sarah, who was Sarah Hopton Russell's mother, was a great gardener and corresponded with William Bartram. It talks about botany a little bit. And then it talks about the Gregorys, who inherited what became known as Wando Plantation. So this plantation has had 3 names. But I wanted to point out that even on this historical marker, which is very recently placed, it is only in the last sentence that the enslaved community at Starvgut Hall is acknowledged. And it says, in 1996, archaeologists excavated the site of William Hopton's Starvgut Hall. They found remnants of 10 buildings and thousands of artifacts associated with the everyday lives of the Hopton family, the plantation overseer, and the enslaved community. And that's it. Now, not every plantation is blessed with the historical records to be able to name people, to be able to connect them back to the land. But it really starts here. If anybody is stopping and looking at these historical markers and they want to know more, they wouldn't know what to ask from this about the enslaved community. So it really starts with organizations like the Historic Charleston Foundation that has a hand in placing markers like this. So we look to evolve that. Happily, it's becoming more popular for historians to add this kind of context to our popular history. You can find it in academia. People weave these complex webs and everything gets really dry and boring. But this is really important information. And it's really wonderful when people reach out and say, we want this information, because we're happy to give it. So thank you again for having me here. Okay, so moving on. We are still with Sarah Russell, Sarah Hopton Russell, the matriarch. In 1788, she finally gets married. She marries Nathaniel Russell at the age of 36. Already progressive. There are a lot of families in which she would have been considered long since an old maid. Never mind that Nathaniel Russell himself is 50 years old when they marry. Now, there's always conversation in the historical context about when older men marry younger women and whether that is a marriage of love and mutual affection or whether it's more of an arranged situation. And I will tell you that the vast majority of marriages that I have researched, that I've seen with these kinds of age gaps, are in fact marriages of mutual love and affection. That just happens to be marriageable age for men and marriageable age for women in the 18th and 19th centuries. So here we are. Also, you have to remember that Sarah Hopton was coming of age to be married as the revolution is happening. Now, it's not that weddings didn't happen during the war, but it was a little harder to meet and mingle, I think. So she probably experienced some of her most marriageable years during times when this city was either explicitly under attack, like the first siege of Charleston, the Battle of Sullivan's Island, or later in the war when things are getting dicey. So it's not unheard of, but it's certainly unusual. It seems to have run in the Hopton family. Sarah's sister didn't get married until she was 45. So Nathaniel Russell isn't from here. She's local, but he's not. He comes from Rhode Island. He's part of a very well-off and well-known family in Rhode Island, and he actually almost left. He came here, he did some business, he wasn't finding business lucrative, and he nearly left. And then he was offered a partnership in a merchant firm, and he decided to stay, which turned out well for him. He ended up getting very wealthy indeed, and it turns out he met and married Sarah. But he had questionable loyalties during the Revolution. I put some bullet points up there. He did serve in the Charleston militia early in the war. He was elected to the General Assembly for the state late in the war. He also left for London as British sieged the city for a second time, and he didn't come back until 1783. And when he did come back, he was confined aboard his ship because the authorities here in Charleston said, you look like a loyalist to us. You left when the city was under siege. You went to England, and then you stayed there until everything was over. And now you're coming back, and you want us to let you in. Great. Needless to say, he was confined for some months in the Charleston harbor aboard his ship. He did eventually convince the authorities that he was a true patriot. He was not a loyalist, and he wasn't subject to seeing his property dispersed, which happened to a lot of loyalists. They evacuated after the war to England, and their properties here in the United States were confiscated and redistributed. He avoided all of that. And yeah, he had to reestablish his, well, I said here with city authorities, which is true. He had to reestablish his reputation, but he also had to reestablish his reputation with the community, with the business community, with the social community. So he had a lot of repair work to do, and it probably didn't hurt that in 5 years' time, he married the daughter of one of the wealthy plantation owners of the town. So that was probably a savvy move for him, as well as, again, being a marriage of mutual love and affection. And ties between Charleston and Rhode Island have always been strong, and they still are today. So there are lots of family papers from the Russells that we can point at between Charleston and Rhode Island as they're writing letters back and forth. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So their marriage is actually pretty progressive. It's progressive in a lot of ways. Firstly, prior to their marriage, a pair of indentures is signed, and I gather that the word indenture just means legal document a lot of times in the 18th century, but it's essentially a prenuptial agreement. It establishes Sarah's right to legally retain ownership of her real estate and her material property even after she's married. Now, if you're unaware, in 1788 and clear through the 19th century, women were not legally allowed to own property after they were married. everything became the property of their husbands, unless their husbands signed a prenup. Sarah's did, and that includes her real estate, her material property, and also the enslaved individuals that she brought with her to the marriage. We know of at least 25 of them, 24 by name, in the Russell archives and at the Russell house. The majority of those enslaved individuals probably lived at the Russell house, 51 Meeting Street, and at the East Bay residence that they occupied before 51 Meeting Street was constructed. So it's important that you understand that not only was Sarah's charity possible because she was wealthy, it was possible because she didn't have to do work. She was an enslaver, as was her husband, and it's important that we acknowledge this truth. The real estate that she retained legal ownership of was a half share in the plantation on the Wando, that brick plantation. So that's pretty huge. She probably saw to it that the brick that the Nathaniel Russell house was built from was actually made at Starvgot Hall. And of course, the enslaved workers who I mentioned, despite knowing the traditional responsibilities of marriage, Sarah Hopton Russell must have grown up with some sort of pretty liberal ideology to have a father, and it was William Hopton's insistence that she sign these indentures with her husband. So there's some really incredibly interesting progressive ideology going on here, even if it's not explicitly written in letters, diaries, family records. Likewise, Nathaniel Russell must have had similar progressive ideals about the rights and abilities of young women to agree to such a document. It's important to note, though, that he was wealthy on his own. He didn't need her money, which was probably another encouraging factor in signing these indentures. Their daughters are born. They only have 2 children, probably because the lateness in life of their marriage. Alicia is the first daughter, and she arrives in 1790, and then Sarah Hopton's namesake, arrives in 1792. At this time, they are living in a residence on East Bay Street. It abuts Longitude Lane. The house is no longer there. The house that's there now is a modern structure with a side garden, and in that side garden originally would have been a brick shed. There was a blacksmith and a cooperage, as well as the standard sort of urban plantation, home, workyard, and garden, pleasure garden. So if we move on. So I just want to give a little bit broader context to Charleston in the 17 and 1800s. Because 40% of all enslaved people who were brought to the United States came through the port of Charleston, this city sees a black majority very early, like 1740 early. Married women, of course, weren't allowed to legally own property, Sarah Russell being an exception. And it's important that you note that the Russells were wealthy, not just because of Sarah's family, but because of his merchant pursuits. He imported and exported all kinds of goods, from spermaceti candles to brass and copper and iron kettles to pimentos. Saw that on a record. But the most lucrative thing that Nathaniel Russell traded in was human cargo. He was a slave trader. He talks about how he can't seem to find anybody to buy his spermaceti candles. He doesn't get it. They love them in Rhode Island. But nobody will buy candles here. And he likes to import and sell rum, but even rum pales in comparison to the profit margins that he achieves by buying and selling people. It was indeed the sale of people that allowed the building of 51 Meeting Street and the life that the Russells enjoyed. On a larger scale, Charleston was very diverse from very early on, both in its social makeup and in its religious makeup. You all know that. We still see it reflected today. There are Episcopalians and Congregationalists and Presbyterians and Huguenots. There are also big Jewish populations here in the city. I'm sure you all know of Congregation Beth Elohim on the other side of Meeting Street. And there's actually probably some pagan, Caribbean, African influence happening here because it's coming with the enslaved individuals from all the various nations in Africa. Remember that people are coming from a lot of different countries and a lot of different tribes, so that's not a monolith in itself. And so then the belief systems that come with them are not monolithic either. Also, a lot of folks who came here enslaved were Muslim. And that was something that was often tried to be sort of either erased or changed, tried to convert into Christianity, and then of course there are laws about Christianizing enslaved communities as well. So it's really a very complex web and pool that's happening in Charleston, and it makes for one of the most diverse metropolises in the New World, which is interesting. Clear class structures are in place here, and those of like socioeconomic statuses mingled, married, and did business. The wealth amassed by the planter class not only allowed gentlemen of leisure to pursue whatever hobbies interested them, it allowed their wives, women of leisure, to some opportunities to figure out ways to be productive, to expand their own spheres, and to have social influence. So again, women can't vote, women can't own property, so how can women exert their influence over society? Well, they're clever, they found ways. So along with these appropriately feminine hobbies, like Sarah Hopton Russell, she inherited the gardener gene from her mother, and she passed it on to her daughter Alicia. They both loved gardening. They also turned to creating charitable organizations. They insisted on running them themselves. This became a job for the wealthy women of the city of Charleston. It became an opportunity to be heard in a society that didn't allow them to be heard in a lot of ways, and it was a chance to be seen in the very best company and to be a part of a group that could be held up as a status symbol. So just a couple of quick pictures of the Russell House in case you haven't been lately. Please go visit the Russell House. So the opulence here, the opulence of life in the Russell House remains. This house has been restored. It is not preserved. And the sense of work yard is what's lost because there's a formal garden to the side of the house now, and the work yard is gone. But the kitchen house and laundry remain to give an experience of what the enslaved community there might have experienced under the tenure of Nathaniel and Sarah Hopton Russell, and later the Haans, and later the Trapiers. And if we go to the next one, just a couple of gratuitous shots of the inside, because everybody loves our staircase. That there is Lydia Middleton. She happens to be one of the enslaved people that was in the Russell family home, actually just before emancipation and during the Civil War. And when freedom came, she did leave. She did leave. So, Sarah Hopton Russell gets ideas about creating charitable organizations. Are we on Sarah Russell Haan now? Right on, thanks, okay. But Sarah Hopton Russell couldn't do it alone. Lucky for her, she's got a couple of daughters who are interested. We'll get to Alicia in a minute. I know that Alicia is not necessarily upheld as a founder of this church, so we're going to talk about Sarah Haan first, and then I'll give you a little insight into her sister. She's 16 years old when the family moves to 51 Meeting Street. Did anybody move when you were a teenager? I did. And so you're in a new neighborhood, and there's new people around, and there's a new house, which your dad happened to decorate in the old style from like 40 years ago. And this is the house that you have to entertain gentlemen callers and try to get married. Oh my gosh. We have a feeling that Sarah might have had some opinions about that. Nonetheless, She did, in fact, marry 5 years later. So she married at the age of 21 in 1813 to Bishop Theodore de Haan, age 37. So again, we see this age disparity, but by all accounts, and I even have some of them quoted here, by all accounts, a marriage of love and mutual affection. They really enjoyed each other's company. Now, how Mr. de Haan found his way into the Russell household has been a matter of gossip and speculation since about the minute it happened. Some people think that Mrs. Hopton Russell was getting near and dear with Bishop de Haan. I don't think he was bishop yet at St. Michael's, and they were friendly, and she would invite him over for tea, knowing full well that she had 2 daughters of marriageable age. But it's, that's adorable, and I think there's probably some truth to that, but you all know probably better than I do that Sarah Hopton Russell's dedication to her mission and to the mission of this church and the benevolent societies before that really speaks to her faith. It really does. So I don't think that we can assign this friendship with Bishop de Haan strictly to a social calculation. I really think that it mattered to her to be a part of St. Michael's congregation and to have the opportunity to do charity works. And I think it was probably a really nice bonus that her daughter and the bishop got along so well that they chose to enter into marriage together and they could pursue this mission together. So they did have 4 children in 3 years. The real tragedy of their marriage is that he died so young. He only was married for 4 years. He passed away at the age of 41, very unexpectedly, of yellow fever. He had been consecrated as bishop in that time, and he left behind a wife and 4 very small kids. So they moved into the Russell house with Sarah Hopton Russell pretty quickly because Sarah de Haan needed help. There was some commentary about the courtship and marriage of Bishop de Haan and Sarah Russell de Haan. A family friend named Catherine Van Horn Reed commented on the union. She said, "The bishop is certainly engaged to be married to Miss Russell, and that he is a very warm and ardent lover. It is a union that promises as much happiness as any I have ever heard of. Her whole life has been a series of piety. Faith and works in her have been united. Her immense fortune has enabled her to be very much the support of many poor families. Thus, you see his merits. His extraordinary goodness is like to be rewarded in this world, as it most assuredly will be in the next." So, the slight exaggeration here might be the fact that a 21-year-old young woman is being described as having a lifetime of faith and piety. It's easy to have a lifetime of good works when you've only had 21 of them. But the message is clear. This is a woman who is very much walking in her mother's footsteps. She wants to be of service to this community. There's an opportunity to have some influence, some good influence in the city. And it's pretty clear that she thinks of Bishop de Haan both as a great partner in marriage and as somebody who she can do that good work with. I'm just checking out my notes here. I got it all. All right, so if we can go on to the next one. So here they are. This is Sarah Russell de Haan. We don't have any images of Sarah Hopton Russell. I'm really sorry if you were coming here hoping to see an image of Sarah Hopton Russell. I was really hoping to see one as I researched too. The Historic Charleston Foundation has no fewer than 2, maybe 3 portraits of Nathaniel Russell. But that's okay. So here is Nathaniel Russell and Sarah Hopton Russell's daughter, Sarah Russell de Haan, and her husband, the Bishop Theodore de Haan. Interestingly enough, this image is painted posthumously. So I'm not really sure how much that looks like him. The family was described, the entire Russell family was described by a young woman named Margaret Izard Manigault. And I'm not sure if Margaret Manigault in this particular moment, in this particular letter, was more of a frenemy. And I'm not really sure if this is meant derogatorily, but I think the way that this is written, any one of the Russells would say, absolutely, that's us. They're excessively devout, attending the services in the church, morning, noon, and night. I mean, if that's what your life's calling is to do, and to do these missions of good faith and charity works, then I don't think that that is so insulting. But then she says, being surrounded by the most sanctimonious of the clergy, and upon the whole, appearing to be righteous overmuch. On Henry's first arrival, Henry is her relation, he was found several times in the drawing room, he, I think, being Reverend Haan. He was found several times in the drawing room reading the Bible with the young lady of the mansion. I mean, I think that there's some social judgment there that's probably misplaced. But that's what she wrote, so that's what I'm telling you. The other thing she said upon the occasion of Bishop de Haan and Sarah Russell de Haan's marriage was really quite sweet. They are making merry in that grave family, just as other folks do upon these occasions. So she clearly acknowledges that the Russells are perhaps not the caricature that she is suggesting, but that they're quite members of the community and quite happy to celebrate a marriage between two affectionate people. So let's go on to the next one. Just a little bit about life in general at 51 Meeting Street. The Russell family moves in again. Sarah is 16, which means her sister Alicia here is 18 years old. Oh, 18 and moving. That's your senior year of high school. Man. So this house would have been noisy. It would have been raucous. There were teenagers and visitors, and later as the girls grow up, there are husbands, and then there are children, and there are enslaved workers moving through in every room in every house, cheek by jowl. The Russells are probably never, ever alone. And it's important that you remember that, because our notions of privacy are really quite different than what 19th and 18th century notions of privacy are. And that's okay. We just need to repopulate these spaces with all of the people who would have been there. It wasn't just quiet adult people having civilized tea and conversation. There were children running around, and there were probably nannies running after them. Alicia and her family visited all the time. Alicia and her husband actually lived with the Russells for a little while, right after their marriage, and then they moved out. Eventually, Nathaniel dies. He dies in 1820 at the age of 80, and after he passed away, Sarah, who was also a widow, of course, moved in with children. The Russell house would have been lively, and this was really the time when the two Sarahs were able to scheme and start to put together these charity organizations and all these plans for really making the city a better place. That was about the time that Alicia left. She perhaps was a little bit more in the world of family and children. She loved to come and visit with her kids, but it seems like she had that sort of short time allowance. I can hang out with my family for this much time. Extended stays are undesirable, which is unfortunate because at one point she really got quite ill in 1826, and during that extended illness, she convalesced in the Russell house with her mother, and her husband was in the Middleton residence. Alicia married Arthur Middleton, a cousin of the Middletons of Middleton Place. And of course, they had their own residence downtown, they had their own residence out in the country, and he was supervising renovations on their townhouse at the time that she was convalescing. So I can imagine that a construction zone would not be a place that you would want to recover from illness. There's some suggestion that Sarah Hopton Russell was somewhat overbearing. It bleeds into her grandchildren. There was a family letter that said something about that the little boys were terrorizing their cousins who were in the house, but to me that's just children being children. And eventually Sarah Hopton Russell and Alicia traveled to New England together later on, while Sarah Haan stayed in Charleston. The Middletons were really on a town and country schedule. It's something that you see very frequently in the 19th century. Some months of the year would be downtown, and then other months of the year would be out in the country. Generally speaking, the downtown time is in the summertime because you can go to the upper floors of houses, you can throw open big windows and catch the harbor breeze. It's better air than out on the plantations, and then wintertime out in the country. And along with that, Alicia frequently welcomed her mother and her sister Sarah's whole family out to the plantation on the Stono where she and Arthur had set up house. So I think that this is a good relationship. I just think that it might have been too many people in too small a space. All right, so moving on. So 1820, Nathaniel Russell passes away. Now there are two widows in the Russell house. And the South Carolina state legislature restricts manumission of enslaved people. They make it almost impossible to manumit enslaved workers. Manumit, sorry, means to free. Yeah, manumission is freeing enslaved people. Sure. In order to manumit an enslaved person starting in 1820 in Charleston, a enslaver would have to petition the South Carolina government, and both houses of the legislature would have to approve the manumission in order for it to go through. As far as I know, the Russell family, neither Nathaniel nor his wife or daughters, ever manumitted anyone ahead of the Civil War. In 1822, of course, Denmark Vesey incites a rebellion. The uprising actually failed. It was revealed by potential conspirators. A number of people were invited to participate. A couple of them decided against, and they revealed the plot to authorities. Interestingly enough, an enslaved man who belonged to the Russells was the armorer of the entire rebellion. His name was Thomas Russell, and he was a blacksmith. He was tried, he was convicted, and he was executed for his part in the uprising. And after the uprising, and remember, Charleston, the city, has been a black majority since 1740. After the uprising of 1822, the state of South Carolina made even more restrictive laws, even up to and including free blacks who come into the city, and most specifically, the Negro Siemens Act. So sailors who are free and coming into port have to either be confined to their ship, or they have to be confined to an inn or a boarding house, confined to their room, with room and board paid in advance by the ship's captain or the company's owner, until the ship made sail again. If those conditions were not met, those free blacks could be taken into custody and sold into slavery by law here in Charleston. Black churches, which had been growing, specifically AME churches, were targeted, had congregations dispersed. Not just that, their buildings were razed to the ground. And generally, a culture of fear sort of permeated and underpinned polite society. People didn't really talk about it, people didn't write about it, but you can see it in the architecture of the city. You can see it in the architecture of the townhomes. And you can read about it a little bit in some of the letters from visitors to this city. For example, chevaux de frise. These are structures that are put up. The shot on the, oh, did we switch? Sorry, there we go. The shot on the left is off of Queen Street, and the shot on the right is the Miles Bruton house. These structures were in place deliberately. High walls, no windows or windows in particular places on a property. Chevaux de frise are largely a 19th century invention as it comes to architecture. It's a very, very old, like Roman invention when it comes to warfare. This keeps certain people out, it keeps certain people in. It's meant to deter movement of enslaved people. Architecture was used to control movement in cities all up and down the eastern seaboard, including Annapolis and New York and Philadelphia and Boston. This is the example in Charleston. Okay, so one more context information slide here, and we're gonna pop back to why it matters to the Sarahs. So Charleston was a slavery-dependent city. That's why it's important. Everything that works here, everything that runs here, happened because of the enslavement of people. Laws, rules, curfews, control, all indicated a fear of another uprising, like Denmark Vessie's, even though people didn't really talk about it. For example, by 1830, more than 57% of Charleston's population was enslaved, so a night curfew was enacted for all free and enslaved blacks. Didn't matter. 9 o'clock in the wintertime, 10 o'clock in the summertime, nobody was allowed out without a written pass after those times, and the curfew was announced by the bells of the churches in the city. They would ring out. Not only that, the drums of the Citadel, which is now a Best Western on Marion Square, the drums of the Citadel would ring out at those hours in the city. Visitors to the city wrote about feeling intimidated. One gentleman visitor said, "It feels like this city is constantly on the verge of revolution and siege." A Swedish traveler named Fredrika Bremer, 20 years later, she was writing in the 1850s, said, "And this is perception, not reality. Blacks swarm in the streets, and 2/3 of the people whom one sees out in the town are blacks or mixed race." And she did not use the words black or mixed race. Now, of course, that's not true. That was her perception. Again, the ratio is still a black majority, but it's not 2/3. And I think what she was picking up on was this energy, this sense of fear that comes after an uprising. Even though the importation of enslaved Africans directly from the continent was outlawed in 1808, it continued in this country until the 1850s, with its heyday in 1858 and 59 in New York City. So, this curfew was supposed to be enforced by a city guard. That's the precursor to our current law enforcement. They didn't seem entirely enthusiastic about chasing down curfew breakers. There were more important crimes to be going after. You can see that in 1837, for example, less than 0.5% of the entire enslaved population of the city is charged with breaking curfew. We know that it was happening because it was a ridiculous law. So how does that matter? Because that's the energy and the city in which Sarah Hopton Russell and Sarah Russell Haan and Sarah Rutledge are doing charitable works. They see that there are problems. This place is beautiful on the surface. And yeah, we can go to the next slide, thank you. This place is beautiful. It's wonderful for visitors. Tourism is not new to Charleston, y'all. People have been coming here to visit since the 1800s, and rightfully so. There is a lot to see and to do and to learn in Charleston, and it is not perfect, and that's okay. Charleston was a bustling city. It really enjoyed a golden age in the early and mid-19th century, and this current of concern just bubbled under the surface. It's possible that that could have intimidated a lot of people, especially women, who were interested in doing charity. But it did not intimidate Sarah Hopton Russell, Sarah Haan, and Sarah Rutledge. It didn't deter them. They went forward anyway, and they brought a lot of women with them. So it's important to understand this undercurrent. It also means that in the 1820s and 30s, the wealthy of Charleston are enjoying all sorts of social occasions: balls, parties, horse races. We've begun a new digital initiative at Historic Charleston Foundation, and here's my commercial for it. It's called Harborside History. You can find it on our YouTube channel and on our website. And February's episode was about Race Week in Charleston. Very important in February in Charleston, and certainly kind of a Mardi Gras celebration, really an exciting time to be in the city, especially if you have disposable income. So almost certainly, even the most devout Russell family participated in the goings-on of Race Week. So you should go check out Harborside History for February on Historic Charleston Foundation's website blog. But really, this would have been a time of such incredible ups and downs, such joy, such celebration, such fear, such concern, anxiety. And of course, anytime we're talking about balls and parties and races, if it's more leisure for the enslaving class, it's more work for the enslaved. So it's important to consider the impact of this societal institution. And it still persists today, although it's in May now, I think, right? Or November? Race Week's not in February anymore. It's the Charleston steeplechase now. And by the way, this image that's closest to me here, it's called Off to the Races, and it's from the 1850s. So that's delightful. You can find it. Google it. It's really an interesting image. So we're going to back up a few years and talk about Russell women in the community. In 1813, Sarah Russell, her daughter Sarah Haan, and her sister Mary Gregory founded not the charity that founded this church. They founded a different one first. It was called the Ladies' Benevolent Society. It was organized specifically to care for the sick and the poor of the city, all the sick and poor of the city, and its motto was, "I was sick and you visited me." We all know that one, right? Yeah, it sounds familiar. It should. So again, even though this is not a religious organization, the Sarah's faith really shines through in all the charity work that they do. Their treasurer always had to be an unmarried woman. Remember I said earlier that the benevolent societies that the Sarahs founded, they really wanted to govern themselves? And we know that women can't own property or legally handle money, so what do? An unmarried woman is the treasurer. And if she's going to get married, we find a new treasurer. So, very progressive in their benevolent society ideas. Sarah Haan never remarried after the bishop passed away. Instead, she threw herself into this charity work wholeheartedly, and she continued it for the rest of her life. The Ladies' Benevolent Society historically insisted that they control their own finances, and that's still true today, by the way. The Ladies' Benevolent Society still exists. They meet in the Russell House once a year, and as far as I understand, the treasurer is still an unmarried woman. It's interesting, this juxtaposition of charity for the enslaved and being an enslaver. I'm not sure how that worked in the minds of these women, but it was there. Those things coexisted. And it's something to think about. We really should think about how that works. So in 1818, 2 years before Denmark Vesey's uprising, Sarah Russell, Sarah Haan, and Sarah Rutledge founded the Charleston Female Domestic Missionary Society. Sometimes it's called the Charleston Female Domestic Episcopal Missionary Society. It was organized specifically to provide for the poor and specifically for enslaved African Americans. They founded a charity specifically for enslaved people whilst enslaving people. And the difference between these two is that the women founded the Ladies' Benevolent Society. It did great works in the community, but it didn't have a faith component. And the ladies decided that there should be a faith component. There should be religious opportunity and education for anyone who wanted it. So instead of adding it to the Ladies' Benevolent Society, they started a whole other charity. It's incredible. And that's what made the difference. So now the Charleston Female Domestic Missionary Society, which is such a mouthful, offers religious care and education as well as providing for the poor and sick of the community. And of course, as you know, in 1822, St. Stephen's Episcopal Church is founded with funds from the Charleston Female Domestic Missionary Society as a place of worship for all people, right? This will be a house of prayer for all people. This was an inclusive congregation. The history on your website is not wrong. It's not wrong. It might be a little incomplete, but it is good. It's an inclusive congregation, including enslaved African Americans, including pregnant single women, and it is the first free church, free, no rental pew fee, for the Episcopal Church in America. Later, the Charleston Female Domestic Missionary Society actually funded the construction of the chapel, and the land over on Gwynard Street was donated by Sarah Hopton Russell. And it's really important that you note that. It was not donated by Nathaniel Russell. It was donated by Sarah Hopton Russell, who retained all of her real estate in ownership. This is where the complexity of human nature really shows itself. The enslavers who start societies and missions to serve the enslaved. So just a couple of really interesting historical documents that are in our archives, or scans of them are, you can come and look. This is the original petition for the creation of the Charleston Female Domestic Missionary Society. It was written and given to the South Carolina State Legislature to make sure that it was okay that these women founded this. We also have, if you move on down to the next slide, a transcription of it, because who can read 1800s writing? I read through it, it's crazy. But we do have a transcription of it as well. So if you want to see these documents, we don't have the actual documents, they're in the state archives in Columbia, but you can come and see scans of them anytime. We have an archivist and you can set up an appointment. Our archives are free and open for any researcher. If you go down to the next one, about the same time that St. Stephen's was founded, there was a gazette founded. It was called the Gospel Messenger, and it was an Episcopalian newspaper. Do you guys still have this? No? Anybody want a project? Gospel Messenger. So this was founded in 1823, and in 1824, there was an article published. It's 4 pages long. This is a really bad scan. You have to come and see it in person if you'd like to read it. This article is specific about the founding of St. Stephen's, the consecration of the cornerstone, and about this congregation being the first free Episcopal congregation in the United States. No pew rental fees. All right, so if you go to the next one, well, we've already talked a little bit about this, Sarah Hopton, her charity and her business. As she's doing the charity work, as she's donating the land for the chapel, she is still engaged in the business of enslavement quite explicitly. In 1823, she petitions the South Carolina State Legislature. Remember Thomas Russell, who we were talking about, the blacksmith and armorer? She petitioned the South Carolina State Legislature, telling them that she had not been compensated enough for her property, which was lost to her. So she was paid a fee for the loss of her property, and she came back later and said, others whose enslaved people you executed got more money than I did. I would like some more. She clearly didn't need it. She did not need it. But this document exists. Just a little bit about Tom Russell. He was a blacksmith. He would have been very valuable as a skilled artisan. He would have probably been hired out using those slave tags that are so unique to Charleston, and he would have been hired out to the shipping businesses on East Bay Street. It is almost certain that Tom Russell lived at 51 Meeting Street with the Russell family. Neighbors gave testimony about Thomas, saying that he was very frequently in Mrs. Russell's company. They knew it because they heard Mrs. Russell telling him not to hang out with a certain other enslaved man named Gullah Jack, because she thought that he would be turned to an influence to bad deeds, and indeed, Gullah Jack was one of the Vesey co-conspirators. It's really interesting because this is Sarah's handiwork alone. Nathaniel Russell had died 3 years earlier. So this was Sarah's initiative, and Sarah's, initiative is the right word, to seek further compensation for her loss of property. She was very dedicated to the missions of healing the sick, fundraising for the poor, creating opportunities for religious education, building a free faith community. And she was a shrewd businesswoman and an enslaver. And it is really important, as we lose nuance in this world today, that we make space for one person to be all of those things. She was all of them. So this document exists as well. We do not have a copy in our archives. I had to ask the state for this. Did you flip it? I had to ask the state for a copy of Sarah's petition for compensation for Thomas Russell, but here it is. And it's free online. You can access it yourself, or you can ask us, because we're gonna have a copy of it tomorrow. This is held at the State Archives in Columbia, but we will have a copy of this literally tomorrow, because there it is, and it's in my computer. All right, so moving along, because I know that I have taken up much of your time, and I'm supposed to leave room for questions, I'm sorry. I told you that there's not much on Sarah Rutledge. Sarah Rutledge was the daughter of Edward Rutledge and Henrietta Middleton Rutledge. She never married. She spent most of her life working in charity, and in fact, this great opus of hers, The Carolina Housewife, which she collected and wrote the recipes for, but which she probably did not cook most of herself, she donated all of the proceeds from the publishing and sale of this cookbook to the Charleston Female Domestic Missionary Society, and therefore to St. Stephen's. So, a lifetime of good works, and about 3 sentences in any historical document you can find. She died in 1855 at the age of 73. And I did manage to find a picture of her gravestone there. Moving to the next, the daughter, Sarah Russell de Haan, she inherited the Russell house when her mother died, but she did pass on her legacy of charity to her daughter. Her daughter was named Sarah Russell de Haan, her first daughter. We have a wonderful family legacy in the Russell family of first children being daughters called Sarah. So she named her Sarah Russell de Haan, and we can distinguish her from her mother by her married name, Trapier. Sarah Trapier ended up also marrying clergy. He was the rector of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church for 4 years, 1836 to 1840, and they lived at 51 Meeting Street with Sarah Trapier's mother, Sarah de Haan, filling the house again, 12 children. The first one was a daughter named Sarah. Sarah Russell de Haan died in 1857 at the age of 65. And really, the Trapier family continued the legacy of clergy being involved with the Russell House. Eventually, the Russell House on Meeting Street became a training school for novice nuns. It was a training house from the Sisters of Mercy. So the Russell House itself has an incredible legacy of being in service to clerical work. Clergy work. And then, of course, Sarah Hopton Russell, the matriarch, she outlives her husband by 12 years. She also dies at the age of 80. And she was eulogized in that same Episcopalian newspaper, the Gospel Messenger. It was 3 pages. She's lionized quite heartily in these 3 pages, as was her husband upon his death. It is clear that these women in their sphere of influence in greater Charleston area really left their marks, especially Sarah Hopton Russell. Whatever goals she might have had, whatever influence in society she may have aspired to, I can confidently say that she achieved it. She achieved it, and so did her daughter, Anne Sarah Rutledge. And perhaps these were unspoken goals because of her gender and her station, but she did enact as much control as she could over her own life, mostly to be of benefit to society. She never did have to reckon with the conflict that ended the enslavement of people in this country, but certainly her grandchildren and their children did. But it might be interesting to study someday the family papers from later generations to see how they did that and to find the thread of Sarah Hopton Russell and Sarah Russell de Haan's influence as it moves through the generations. But these were incredible women who founded this place. They were complex and they were human, and I hope that this is something in line with what you were hoping to learn about today, a little bit more about their lives, their world. It was really an interesting place to be, just like America is now, just in a different way. So I really thank you for your attention. I thank you for allowing me to come here and share these things with you. I think that you absolutely have a source of pride in these women and a source of pride to know the truth about the more complex sides of who they were. And I just really thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm so sorry. I'm now at 6:06 p.m. Thanks.
So if you just want to get some light. Though it is 6:06, I would like to have some time for questions if you have them. I would just say as an aside that Paul Trapier is a significant figure. As I understand it, Paul's name appears at Calvary Episcopal Church. And is that right? Is it Paul Trapier? I feel like Paul Trapier was one of the first clergy to serve at Calvary and was sent there from St. Michael's, and Calvary is one of our historically black Episcopal churches in the diocese that Ann Brumell now serves. I think somewhere over the altar area, I've been in Calvary's church, there's the Trapier name somewhere there. Yeah, okay. Okay. And before we open it up for questions, I would just like to say, as an aside, that I am co-chair of a commission on the diocese focused on racial justice and reconciliation. That is very much a priority of Bishop Ruth's episcopacy with us. It's something that she believes very deeply in, that mission, and part of that mission is telling the history accurately, and I think the Episcopal Church has a lot of history that we need to talk about because we were the denomination of the founders of this city, and I am co-chair of a task force on that larger commission that is currently beginning work, and it's going to take some time at Bishop Ruth's behest to begin, like our city has done, to put together a document where the Episcopal Church formally issues an apology, a public apology for the role that the church has played in the slave trade. And that is something that will be coming in time. The other thing I would just say is, as we move forward in time, the three Sarahs, as I understood it, when the original St. Stephen's was erected, made the decision to have that passage that we make so much of today from the prophet Isaiah put into the edifice of the church. My house shall be a house of prayer for all people. And it's interesting when you step back and look at the broad sweep of our now 200-year history, how God has been at work in this congregation, I think, helping this church to live more fully into its mission over time. Because just 100 years after this mission was founded, through a number of different events, and we will talk about that in the month of May, St. Stephen's becomes one of the black Episcopal churches in the diocese, and We were entirely an African-American congregation here for many decades. And just as a little plug, on May the 1st at 5 p.m., we will be speaking about our African-American history here at St. Stephen's, so stay tuned for that. But I do want to give an opportunity for you to ask Karen some questions.
For the digital watchers, Charles asked if I considered publishing any of this in any form. I have not, but if you would like a pamphlet, I could probably figure out a way to make some of these slides into something paper or something that you could have. Oh, okay, there's applause about that. I mean, I'll certainly get you the slides so that you can see these images up close and personal on your own computers, but if there's a if there's an appetite for such a thing, I'd be happy to work with you and figure out a way that we can do that.
I think at least for our records, it would be useful to have the slides.
Certainly. Thank you. Thanks, Charles. It's always good to see you. Back there?
Please also make it available electronically.
Electronically, sure. Y'all have a wonderful brochure on your website about some of your history. It's really lovely. There's a page and then there's a whole other brochure that looks like a PDF file that you can print. It's really lovely, whoever did that. Yes, sorry. I'm trying.
That letter to the legislature had 6 signatories, and we have the 3 Sarahs here. I'm just wondering, is there any stories that you're aware of the history of the other 3?
So interestingly enough, actually, Sarah Rutledge isn't on here. She wasn't one of the original petitioners for the congregation. I'm sorry. The question was about the 6 signatories on the original petition for the founding of the Charleston Female Domestic Missionary Society. And Sarah Rutledge isn't on here. It's Sarah Russell, Sarah Haan, Sarah Waring, Eliza Deese, Sarah Logan, and Elizabeth Ryan. And I confess I do not know anything about those other women, but I expect if they were of the same caliber and inclination to mission that the Sarahs were, we can probably find something in the archives. Mm-hmm. Ma'am.
I just wanted to add my plea for some sort of printed version on behalf of those who are hard of hearing, because I had a little trouble with some of it. It was very helpful to have visuals.
Sure.
And you have a lot of very interesting research, and I would like to be able to access it more easily.
Of course, thank you. That was a request again for printed material, so we can certainly do that. Yes?
Did Russell's also give this property?
Not to my knowledge, no. I'm not sure where Anson Street comes from, where this land comes from, but to my knowledge, it wasn't Sarah Russell's property. Yes?
Is there anything you can point us to that's written about the nature of worship here in Charleston? And was there ever any time that there was corporal worship where Black and white people were in the same building?
Yeah, I think the Gospel Messenger probably talks about that a little bit, and it would be a request to the state archivist. The question was about the nature of worship in the city in earlier days, and I think that you would want to look to records of congregations or into the state archives to see. I wasn't even aware that the Gospel Messenger existed, except that we have some copies that reference the Russells, and so then I looked into it a little further and said, oh, this is a publication on behalf of the Episcopal Church in Charleston. So there might have been from other denominations, other similar publications that you could take a look at. The State Archives has a really lovely online digital collection, and if it lists something but it doesn't have a scan of it accessible right there, there's an email address that you can email and they'll send you a scan. So, yeah. Sir? Sure. The question was about the Grimke sisters being active during this time. I think they're a little bit later in time. I think we're talking about during the Civil War, so perhaps a decade or so before that, we start to see the Grimke sisters come in, the 1850s. So right at the end of the lives of the 3 Sarahs, there's a new generation, this time some abolitionists coming in and sort of picking up the mission. Yeah. Yes?
I think, thank you so much for this lecture. You really gave us, I think, a flavor of what Charleston was like. You mentioned that the enslaved population was 57%, and so that would have meant the white population would have been 43%. And I'm just curious about what that 43% did, like to earn a living. I mean, they weren't all wealthy.
Right.
The Russells and the Haans.
So interestingly enough, the question was about the 43% in the city that's white and how certainly not all of them are of the planter class. And that's true. So in 1837, when 57% of the population is enslaved, there is a working and middle class of European Americans in the city. And in fact, there are state records of those working class people complaining about the number of enslaved people who do the same jobs as them. They can't find work. Coopers in particular were targeted by their own words. There were so many enslaved coopers that free European American coopers couldn't find work. So there is certainly a population, and we have to remember that the working class in the 18th and 19th centuries is really quite specific. If you were a cooper, a barrel maker, you were not a carpenter. So you couldn't do multiple things. So we're talking about, you know, that old nursery rhyme, butchers and bakers and candlestick makers. There's coopers and blacksmiths and brick masons and carpenters and furniture makers. They're called cabinet makers. There are wood turners. And so, I mean, just everything. Farmers coming into town to sell at the market, and seamstresses and tailors. And those are different from, you know, textile merchants and shoemakers, cobblers. So there are a lot of people here who are not of the wealthy class, who are not enslaving people, or if they are, it's maybe only one or two people. But they're complaining because they are, in fact, the minority population, and they can't find work. And they petition for all sorts of laws to be passed in the middle of the 19th century to enable themselves to have work and not the enslaved people, and none of those laws stick. Most of them don't even make it to, you know, the legislature. Anyone else? Sorry, I know we're very late.
I just also wanted to say real briefly that in hearing this lecture, it's to me feels even more appropriate, but another thing in our schedule for this year will be a bicentennial evensong that we are planning for October the 23rd at 5 p.m. Our organist and choirmaster, Wayne Helmly, is commissioning an anthem for our church that will be debuted that day. And we hope to have Bishop Ruth with us, and during that service, in the context of that worship service, with the vestry support, because we do not have any physical evidence really in the church of our African American history, we are going to commission another memorial stone that is going to go next to the three Sarahs there that will memorialize our African American history and the contributions of the generations of African American worshipers who made this place what it was for so many years, and are in many respects our modern day mothers and fathers of the church we are today. So, yeah. Oh, sure.
Okay, no, I'm really sorry. Okay, so the Historic Charleston Foundation is also celebrating a major anniversary this year, and I'm just thrilled that we share an anniversary year. It is the 75th anniversary of the chartering of the Historic Charleston Foundation. Our charter day is in April, so not only is this Women's History Month, but this is a really big year for Historic Charleston Foundation, which I was supposed to say way back at the beginning. So thank you very much for allowing me to bring Historic Charleston Foundation to you. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so very much for coming tonight. Have a good evening. Yeah.